stared at it, marveled at its beauty, its genius. Billions of people just living out their lives. I hate this place. This zoo. This prison. This reality.
You start getting frightened of it. Faith in our leaders. We're optimistic as to what becomes of it all. It really boils down to the broadcast every second of every day through our television sets. All I ever have to do is be famous. People watch me, and they love me. You can have a little taste of the good life too. Now I know you want it. Hell, everybody does. Do it to your own kind. What's the threat? We all sell out every day. Might as well be on the winning team. The real men of the world have to stand up and say, I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And all of the bubblegum.
Greetings, citizens of a doctored reality. Leaked military intel documents. Unconventional warfare highlighted drops by WikiLeaks. US Army stated that major global financial institutions, such as International Monetary Fund, I.M.F, the World Bank and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, are used as financial weapons in times of conflict up to and including large-scale general war, as well as in leveraging the policies and cooperation of state governments.
Have you ever heard of WikiLeaks? Sure you have, but you might not be familiar with one of their leaks, one that reveals that the US military is using the I.M.F and the World Bank to ultimately pursue regime change.
The document, officially titled Field Manual FM 305.130, Army Special Operations Forces Unconventional Warfare, originally written in September 2008, was recently highlighted by WikiLeaks on Twitter in light of recent events in Venezuela as well as the years-long US-led economic siege of the country through sanctions and other means of economic warfare. The document has generated new interest in recent days. It had originally been released by WikiLeaks in December 2008 and has been described as the military's regime change handbook.
The tranche that was released back in the year 2008 is called Manual FM 3-05.130, short for Financial Instrument of U.S. National Power and Unconventional Warfare, in short, a regime change manual.
WikiLeaks' more recent tweets pertaining to the subject drew attention to a specific section of the 248-page document that is titled Financial Instrument of U.S. National Power and Unconventional Warfare. The section in this specific article. The document states these weapons of financial destruction can be used by the U.S. military to create financial incentives or disincentives to persuade adversaries, allies and surrogates to modify their behavior at the theater strategic, operational, and tactical levels, and that such unconventional warfare campaigns are highly coordinated with the State Department and the intelligence community in determining which elements of the human terrain in U.S. Unconventional Warfare Operations Area are most susceptible to financial engagement. Unilateral and indirect financial power through persuasive influence to international and domestic financial institutions regarding availability of loans, grants, or other financial assistance to foreign state and non-state actors, as well as the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, as U.S. diplomatic financial venues to accomplish such goals. Specifically names the World Bank, I.M.F. and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
But it's so great for the U.S. to push regime change in other countries? You be the judge. Well, the leaks actually specifically named these organizations: the World Bank, the I.M.F, the Bank of International Settlements, and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. These are what they call U.S. diplomatic financial venues to accomplish such goals namely regime change.
Another point of interest is that these financial weapons are largely governed by the National Security Council, NSC, which is currently headed by John Bolton. The document notes that the NSC has primary responsibility for the integration of the economic and military instruments of national power abroad. Let's us not forget John Bolton on Iran.
John Bolton, you remember John Bolton? He's going to be President Trump's national security advisor. You think he changed his mind? No, in fact, if anything, John Bolton has become more determined that there needs to be regime change in Iran.
This policy review to understand what we want the outcome to be and what in the United States many of us are working toward. I have said for over 10 years since coming to these events that the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullah's regime in Tehran.
Though the Unconventional Warfare Manual is notable for stating so openly that independent financial institutions like the World Bank and the I.M.F. are essentially extensions of U.S. government power, analysts have noted for decades that these institutions have consistently pushed U.S. geopolitical goals abroad. This past Monday, it was reported that President Donald Trump nominated former Bear Stearns economist David Malpass to lead the World Bank. Malpass had famously failed to foresee the destruction of his former employer during the 2008 financial crisis and is likely to limit World Bank loans to China and to countries allied or allying with China, given his well-established reputation as a China hawk.
Today it's my pleasure to announce my choice for the next president of the World Bank, Mr. David Malpass. And I've known David for a long time, very extraordinary man. With us
As
today.
major decisions require an 85% majority, the United States can block any major changes to World Bank policy or the services it offers. Furthermore, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, former Goldman Sachs banker and foreclosure king, Steve Mnuchin, functions as the World Bank's governor.
Donald Trump promised to drain the swamp, but then he said f*** it, because nothing says swamp like picking Wall Street banker and foreclosure king Steven Mnuchin to be the next Treasury Secretary.
Foreclosure machine. According to the California Reinvestment Coalition, WoRld foreclosed on more than 36,000 homeowners under Mnuchin.
As a consequence of the lopsided influence of the U.S. on these institutions' behavior, these organizations have used their loans and grants to trap nations in debt and have imposed structural adjustment programs on these debt-saddled governments that result in the mass privatization of state assets, deregulation, and austerity that routinely benefit foreign corporations over local economies. Very institutions, by pressuring countries to deregulate their financial sector and through corrupt dealings with state actors, bring about the very economic problems that they then swoop in to fix. Given the close relationship between the US government and these international financial institutions, it should come as little surprise that, in Venezuela, the US-backed interim President Juan Guaido has already requested IMF funds, and thus IMF-controlled debt, to fund his parallel government.
The Trojan horse for the return of neoliberalism in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, stated that he's going to borrow money from the IMF to fund his government, which would make all Venezuelans indebted to this predatory institution. Guaido spends the money, and the poor and working people work to pay taxes, which pay off the principal and the interest.
This is highly significant because it shows that top among Guaido's objectives, in addition to privatizing Venezuela's massive oil reserves, is to again shackle the country to the US-controlled debt machine. Let us not forget that Venezuela's previous elected president, Hugo Chavez, broke ties with IMF and World Bank, which he noted were dominated by US imperialism.
Gentlemen, from this rostrum, the President of the United States, the gentleman to whom I refer as at the devil, came here talking as if he owned the world. Truly, as the owner of the world. The world tyrant's statement, cynical, hypocritical, full of this imperial hypocrisy, from the need they have to control everything. They say they want to impose a democratic model, but that's their democratic model. It's the false democracy of elites, and I would say a very original democracy that's imposed by weapons and bombs and firing weapons. What a strange democracy. Aristotle might not recognize it, or others who are at the root of democracy. What type of democracy do you impose with Marines?
Thinking ahead, Venezuela and other left-wing governments in Latin America worked together to co-found the Bank of the South as a counterbalance to the I.M.F. and World Bank. However, Venezuela is far from the only country in Latin America being targeted by these financial weapons masquerading as independent financial institutions. For instance, Ecuador, whose current president has sought to bring the country back into Washington's good graces, has gone so far as to conduct an audit of its asylum of journalist and WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange in order to win a $10 billion bailout from the I.M.F. Ecuador granted Assange asylum in 2012, and the U.S. has fervently sought his extradition for still sealed charges ever since.
Why did the government of Ecuador decide to rescind the political asylum and the Ecuadorian citizenship of Julian Assange?
When Mr. Assange was apprehended in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, he was still Ecuadorian. He was naturalized Ecuadorian, and as far as we know, the Ecuadorian state still hasn't concluded the process of stripping him from his nationality. So this is really serious. And it is in breach actually of certain things of international law, but it's really in breach of the Ecuadorian laws and constitution.
Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno justified the decision in a tweeted video as follows.
Today I announce that the discourteous and aggressive behavior of Mr. Julian Assange and the hostile and threatening declarations of its allied organizations against Ecuador, and especially the transgressions of international treaties, have led the situation to a point where the asylum of Mr. Assange is unsustainable and no longer viable. Ecuador sovereignly has declared to terminate the diplomatic asylum granted to Mr. Assange in 2012.
Coincidental. Not long after a trip by Vice President Pence to convince Ecuador to hand over Julian Assange, a $4.2 billion I.M.F. loan appears on the scene. Then Ecuador follows through and delivers the WikiLeaks publisher to face the wrath of the U.S. political establishment.
A multi-billion-dollar I.M.F. loan that Lenin Moreno recently agreed to with the International Monetary Fund, a notorious vehicle of soft power for the U.S., which also ironically has a very long history of trapping Latin American countries in kind of neo-colonial debt bondage. And then of course there is a domestic corruption scandal involving the president. So maybe can you talk about why Lenin Moreno would so blatantly violate, as you mentioned, not only his own country's laws, but international law?
Yeah, I think the two factors you've just mentioned are correct. Since Lenin Moreno came to power, there's been a major realignment of foreign policy and sort of geopolitical doctrine and security doctrine, whatever. So we've seen a move back into the US fold and a alignment with the Trump administration. There have been a few key visits. So Paul Manafort back in just went in 2017, just after Moreno was elected, and then more recently Vice President Pence going to Ecuador.
Last July, the US threatened Ecuador with punishing trade measures if it introduced a measure at the UN to support breastfeeding over infant formula, in a move that stunned the international community but laid bare the willingness of the US government to use economic weapons against Latin American nations.
The the United States turned to threats at the World Health Assembly in an effort to quash a resolution that sought to promote breastfeeding, the New York Times reported Sunday. The resolution was originally expected to be introduced by Ecuador, but the U.S. warned that if the country went through with introducing the measure, it would cut military aid and implement punitive trade measures, the Times reported. The resolution holds that breastfeeding is the healthiest option for young children and pushes countries to limit the spread of inaccurate information about breast milk substitutes. The U.S. pushed to couch the language in the resolution, including one part that pledged to, quote, protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. In a statement to the Times, the Department of Health and Human Services, the agency that led the water to push down the resolution, argued that the original text would have, quote, placed unnecessary hurdles for mothers seeking to provide nutrition to their children.
Other recent targets of massive I.M.F. and World Bank warfare also include Argentina, which awarded the largest I.M.F. bailout loan in history just last year. That loan package was heavily pushed by the United States, according to a statement from Treasury Secretary Mnuchin released last year. Notably, the I.M.F. was instrumental in causing the complete collapse of the Argentinian economy in 2001, sending a poor omen for last year's approval of the record loan package.
Thousands poured into the streets in Argentina to say no to the I.M.F. Many schools, hospitals and public administration offices were shut down, and most flights were cancelled during the nationwide strike on September 25th. But why? The walkout was called by unions after President Masri introduced austerity measures to receive additional funding from the I.M.F.
Estamos en contra de este gobierno ajustador, porque lo que hace gobierna para ricos y nos está matando a los pobres. No tenemos educación, no tenemos salud.
The move followed the central bank's decision to raise interest rates to 60%, the highest in the world.
Though it was released over a decade ago, this U.S. coup manual recently highlighted by WikiLeaks serves as a salient reminder that the so-called independence of these financial institutions is an illusion and that they are among the many financial weapons regularly used by the U.S. government to bend countries to its will and even overthrow U.S. disfavored governments. The world is a stage and you are being played. We are not Jesus. Nor do we have Alzheimer's. Expect us.
Remember